Claire Brodie refilled the sugar dispensers for the third time, not because they needed it, but because habit made the silence easier. The cafe smelled of strong drip coffee and apple butter toast. Outside, the streets of Summit Falls lay quiet under a soft blanket of snow. It was the kind of cold that settled in the bones and stayed there, the kind Claire's mother used to fight off with strong cinnamon tea and layers of flannel. Claire's table had opened at 5, as always. The neon "open" sign buzzed faintly in the window. A Patsy Cline song crackled through the old radio perched near the pie case, as familiar to the room as the chime of the front door. The apron with her mother's faded initials, M.B., hung where it always did, on the hook beside the stove. Claire hadn't worn it since the funeral. She kept it there because removing it would feel like a kind of silence she wasn't ready for. By 6:15, Hank Terrell had taken his usual seat, booth number 3, facing the door, back to the wall. His olive green jacket still had a faded military patch, and his cane rested against the table's edge like a companion. Claire poured his coffee without needing to ask. "You're early, Hank." He gave a slow shrug. "Back still hurts when it's going to snow again." "You think it's not snowing enough already?" she teased, setting a paper placemat down in front of him. "Never trust a first snow. The second one always bites harder." Claire smiled, already sliding 2 slices of rye into the toaster. A moment later, Irene McCall bustled in, rubbing her gloved hands together. "I almost slipped on Maine," Irene said, setting down her purse. "One more week and they'll salt the roads like it's a pancake breakfast." "Sit by the heater," Claire said, handing her a mug. "You want the usual?" "Of course I do," Irene said, unfolding a local newspaper that crinkled like dry leaves. "You heard from Nell lately?" Claire hesitated. "She called yesterday. Wants me to come to Kansas for Thanksgiving." "Well?" Irene asked over the rim of her mug. Claire gave a small shake of her head. "This place doesn't close, not when folks like Hank need a warm chair." "You mean stubborn folks like Hank?" Irene muttered with affection. Hank grunted. "This chair's better than any sofa in Kansas." As the morning wore on, a few more locals came in, Tommy the plumber for a bacon biscuit to go, a young mother with 2 children who marveled at the Christmas lights Claire had strung early. She gave the kids cinnamon donut holes in white paper napkins, just as her mother once had. The children's smiles were the kind that made quiet days feel full. By dusk, the bell above the door had gone silent. Claire wiped the same table twice, then reached for her coat. She turned off the neon sign and flipped the chalkboard menu to closed. The radio had gone to static, and she left it that way, oddly comforted by the soft white noise. Out on the street, the snow had stopped. The lamplight caught the glitter of it on the pavement. Claire turned to lock the front door and paused. Across the road, beneath the awning of the old hardware store, a man stood motionless. He wasn't close enough to make out clearly, but his posture was strange, neither relaxed nor ready to move. He didn't seem to be waiting for anyone, just existing. He didn't approach, didn't make a sound. Claire hesitated, her key still in the lock, but he didn't move. The moment stretched. Finally, she looked away and shut the door, bolting it tight. She turned off the lights in the front room. When she looked through the blinds a minute later, the man was gone. Her hands were still on the counter when the last of the street lights flickered out. She stood there longer than she needed to. The next morning, on the back bench behind the cafe, Claire found a wool cap soaked through with melting snow, a silent imprint that someone had been sitting there for a very long time. The back door creaked open with the wind, and there he was, huddled near the trash bins, not asking for anything, not looking for pity. Claire had opened that door just to shake out the mop, not expecting to find anyone, certainly not the same figure from the night before. He didn't flinch when the door opened, didn't meet her eyes, didn't beg. Just sat still, as if he'd learned stillness was safer. His coat looked heavy, military maybe, the kind meant to last through more than one winter. His hands, bare and raw, were folded under his arms for warmth. She stared for a beat longer than she should have, then slowly stepped back inside. In the quiet of the cafe, She opened the pie warmer and pulled 2 oatmeal cookies off the tray, the ones with cranberries her mother used to love. She poured coffee into a thermos and slipped a paper napkin around it to keep the heat longer. No hesitation, no second guessing, just motion. She stepped back outside, the door hissing shut behind her. Snow ticked against the metal trash lid, and her boots crunched faintly on the salted concrete. Without looking directly at him, Claire placed the small box on the top step and said, "In case someone lost their way." He looked up, and for the first time she saw the full side of his face. The scars were deep and uneven, skin stretched in places where fire had stolen the contours. His right eye didn't quite open the same as the left. The damage didn't end there. His jaw had lost symmetry, and one hand barely uncurled as he reached for the box. He paused, eyes flicking up to hers, unsure. She met his gaze without flinching. "No name needed," she said gently. "No catch, just warm up." He gave a small bow, not formal but deliberate. Then, slowly, he stepped inside behind her, careful not to trail snow across the floor. She didn't point him toward a table, and he didn't ask. Instead, he chose the farthest corner booth, the one half hidden by a potted plant and years of quiet shadows. He set the coffee down first, as if it were fragile. Claire wiped down the counter again, then the table nearest the door, then reached for a pie knife she didn't need. Anything to let the silence between them exist without pressure. Dean took small sips from the thermos, both hands shaking slightly. When he tried to hold the cookie, his fingers trembled too much to grip it properly. He set it back down, not frustrated, just resigned. She saw all of it, and still said nothing. 10 minutes passed, maybe 15. The old clock above the register ticked with soft insistence. A flicker of wind rattled the back door again. Claire moved to close it just as Hank stepped inside, brushing off his shoulders. He paused when he noticed the man in the booth, but said nothing, not even a glance too long. Instead, he nodded to Claire and handed her a folded $5 bill. "For the pie," he said. "You didn't order any." "Didn't need to," Hank replied, then reached into his coat pocket and drew something out. He walked to Dean's booth slowly, placed the object gently on the table next to the thermos, and left without another word. Claire waited until the door closed behind him. Only then did she approach the booth. She didn't sit, only glanced at the small wooden coin now resting near the edge. It was smooth, warm-toned, engraved with words in a soldier's hand. "You matter more than medals." Dean looked at it for a long time, then turned to her. "You're the first person to look at me and not flinch." Claire tilted her head slightly, not as a challenge, but as a kind of shrug. "Coffee doesn't care what you look like," she said softly. "Neither do I." She left the coin where it was. He didn't stay long after that, drank the last of the coffee, wiped his hands clean with a napkin, and stood slowly, like someone used to pain in the joints. As he pulled his old backpack over one shoulder, Claire picked up a hand-knitted blanket from the bench near the coat rack. Her mother had made it during her last winter, a thick blue thing with white zigzags across the middle. Claire held it out. "For the cold." He hesitated, then took it with a nod and tucked it carefully into the crook of his arm. He didn't speak again, just walked to the back door, opened it slowly, and stepped out into the falling snow. As he left, Dean left the wooden coin on the table. Claire picked it up, her hand shaking slightly. Claire found him again. This time, curled up behind the cafe's propane tank, soaking wet, teeth chattering through clenched jaws. The rain had turned icy, the kind that made roofs groan and gutters clog with slush. She hadn't expected to find anyone out back when she went to secure the storage shed. But there he was, Dean, knees pulled to his chest, arms wrapped around himself, back pressed to the aluminum siding like he was trying to disappear inside it. His coat was soaked through, plastered to his shoulders. The wool blanket she'd given him the night before was balled against his side, useless in this kind of cold. Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from the helplessness of it. For a moment, She was a child again, watching her father return from overseas, his duffel bag heavier than he was, his eyes somewhere far away, shoulders hunched like he could fold into himself and vanish. Claire stepped back inside without a word. She flicked the lock off the back door and swung it open. "You'll catch your death out there," she said softly, holding the door wide. He didn't move at first, then slowly, with effort, he stood. Water dripped from his sleeves onto the mat. His boots squelched softly as he stepped inside. Claire didn't point him toward a table this time. He already knew. He walked past the dim pie case and the row of stools, past the silent jukebox and the turned chairs. He stopped at booth 4. Claire's mother had sat there every afternoon, even when business was slow, even when the world was too much. She'd drink chamomile tea with honey and sketch menu ideas on paper napkins. The photo of her still hung near the window, caught now in the yellow glow of the single ceiling bulb still left on. Dean lowered himself slowly into the booth, his back pressing against the vinyl seat with a quiet sigh. Claire put the kettle back on the stove. It hissed and sang as steam rose again. She ladled pumpkin soup into a wide ceramic bowl, her mother's favorite blue-rimmed ones, and set out 2 grilled cheese sandwiches, the edges perfectly crisp. She placed the plate in front of Dean without speaking, then left a folded towel beside it. Dean unwrapped the towel with care, drying his hands in slow movements. He didn't reach for the food immediately. Instead, he looked around the café, gaze pausing at the photo on the wall. "I was stationed near here," he said, his voice hoarse, not from disuse, but from something older. "Long time ago. Felt different then." Claire sat at the counter, not across from him, but in view. "I remember the base," she replied, eyes on the kettle. "Used to watch the parades as a girl." Dean nodded, lips pressed tightly. "I left this town a different man than I came in. When I came back, I wasn't sure it would still let me in." He lifted the spoon carefully, sipping from it, like each movement had to be measured. His hand still shook, but less than before. Claire didn't ask more. She didn't need a story. She knew what silence meant when words weren't safe. Instead, she fetched another towel, this one thicker, folded neatly from the shelf near the backroom door. She placed it next to him and stepped away. The soup disappeared slowly. The sandwiches cooled, but were eaten all the same. Dean said nothing more. He didn't need to. When the wall clock struck 1 a.m., its soft chime echoed through the quiet. The rain had slowed, tapping lightly now against the windows. Wind curled under the back door like a whisper. Dean lay across the booth, using the second towel as a pillow. Claire dimmed the last light. She watched him sleep for a moment, saw how his chest rose and fell with effort, how his brow furrowed even in rest. Then she turned to wipe down the coffee machine one last time. That's when she saw it. On the edge of the table, just beside the now empty bowl, rested a dog tag. Metal worn, chain tangled loosely. She picked it up slowly, afraid the moment might break if she moved too fast. Her fingers trembled as she read the engraving under the glow of the countertop lamp. Foster D. U.S. Army. O.P.O.S. She looked back at him, asleep now, face softened by rest. Her throat tightened, but she made no sound. She slipped the tag gently into a clean napkin and placed it back where he'd left it. Then she reached under the counter, tore a scrap of paper from the receipt book, and wrote a simple note. She quietly wrote a note and stuck it behind the counter. Booth 4 reserved. The next morning, Claire found the blanket neatly folded, the seat empty, and the dog tag gone, like he had never been there. The air had a hush to it, as if the snow had muffled the world's voice overnight. The cafe lights flickered on with their usual low hum, casting soft gold over the counter and the old checkered floor. Claire moved more slowly than usual. Her boots left damp prints on the threshold, then faded quickly on the warming tile. She looked toward booth 4 out of habit, still set, still quiet. But the shape of it was different today. Too neat, too still. The blanket she had given Dean was folded squarely on the cushion, corners aligned. The dog tag that had sat silently beside his empty bowl the night before was no longer there. Her eyes lingered on the space as she stepped closer, one hand brushing the edge of the table. The wood was worn smooth from years of elbows, coffee mugs, and quiet afternoons. She remembered her mother resting her fingertips there, the same way, when someone she cared for had gone off without goodbye. "Some people only pass through our lives to leave us better," her mother once said. The phrase echoed in her mind, soft as snow. Irene arrived just after sunrise, wrapped in her usual quilted coat, cheeks red from the cold. She shook the snow off her boots by the door and gave Claire a long look before speaking. "You all right, hun?" Claire didn't answer right away. She glanced back at the booth again and then to the counter, where the morning pastries waited, untouched. "Booth 4's empty," she said quietly. Irene said nothing more, just nodded and took her usual seat by the front window, unfolding her newspaper with hands that had known how to wait. Later that morning, just as the sun tried to break through the clouds, the door opened and brought in a gust of cold air, along with Sheriff Halston. He smelled of cedar and pipe tobacco, the kind of presence that felt older than the town itself. "Morning, Claire," he said, nodding politely to Irene. Claire nodded back. "Coffee, Sheriff?" "Always," he said with a smile, then hesitated. "Actually, something else too." He stepped closer, glancing over his shoulder before lowering his voice just enough. "You haven't seen anyone lately? A stranger? Tall fellow? Heavy coat? Maybe some facial scarring?" Claire's stomach tightened. "Someone mentioned him near Maine," the sheriff continued. "Nothing happened, but folks worry more these days." She poured his coffee without a word, the smell grounding her. "He wasn't a problem," she said calmly. "Just needed warmth." Halston studied her face for a moment longer than necessary, then gave a slow nod and took his mug to the far end of the counter. As the day passed, more snow came and went. A few travelers stopped by, but none stayed long. The words, "Gratitude Soup, free to all," remained chalked on the blackboard by the register, untouched from yesterday. Claire left it up. By sundown, the town seemed to fold into itself. Lights dimmed behind frosted windows and chimney smoke curled like old stories into the sky. Thanksgiving was days away, but there was no bustle in Summit Falls, just a quiet expectation, as if the holiday had already come and gone. Claire brewed a fresh pot of coffee just after 6. She didn't drink any. She poured 2 cups and left one at booth 4, the steam curling faintly in the glow of the hanging lamp. Then she sat by the register, the security monitor casting blue light on her face. She rewound the camera from the night before, fast-forwarded, stopped, watched. At 3:18 a.m., a figure moved behind the café, slow, deliberate. Dean emerged from the back room with his backpack on. He paused by the propane tank for a moment, adjusted the blanket under one arm, then stepped into the snow. He never turned around. The frame showed him moving farther and farther into the white, until the snow blurred his shape and he disappeared. Claire stared at the frozen image on the screen, her own reflection barely visible in the glass. She reached below the counter, opened the small box where Hank's wooden coin had been kept since yesterday. She took it out, held it in her palm for a long while, then set it down beside the framed photo of her mother. Claire puts Hank's wooden coin back on the counter next to the picture of her mother. Some debts aren't meant to be repaid. At 6:12 a.m., the cafe windows rattled as if a train were arriving, but no train ran through Summit Falls. Claire was behind the counter, her hands wrapped around the same chipped mug she used every morning. The coffee inside had gone cold. The sky outside was thick with fog, low-hanging and gray, like the town had overslept. A soft ticking came from the wall clock. Booth 4 was empty. She had opened the cafe as usual. The radio played quietly in the background, some soft jazz she didn't remember switching on. The pot roast was already in the back slow cooker, and the pie crusts were chilling in the fridge. Everything moved in its usual rhythm, until the windows began to hum. Not the kind of hum from passing trucks or snowplows. This was deeper, more rhythmic. The kind that reached inside the walls and rattled the picture frames. Claire stepped out from behind the counter. A coffee cup trembled gently on its saucer, the surface of the brew rippling like a pond. Then came the sound, unmistakable, not imagined, not dreamt. Last night she had tossed in and out of sleep, haunted by a soft drumming in the air and the memory of a look from booth 4. Final, unreadable, like someone preparing to leave. She had chalked it up to grief, maybe even guilt. Now it was real. Outside snow swirled in little cyclones near the rooftops as two figures in formal military coats approached the front door. Claire unlocked it before they knocked. "Ma'am," one said, offering a crisp salute and a respectful nod. "Major Dean Foster has requested to speak with you." She blinked. "Dean?" The soldier only nodded again and stepped aside. And then Dean appeared, not in the worn coat she remembered, not with the same slouched gait or cautious steps. He wore a dark green Special Forces uniform, the kind that gleamed with medals and purpose. His hat was tucked under his arm, and though his face still bore the burn scars, his posture was that of a man who had returned to his own skin. He stood at the edge of the cafe's entryway, not quite stepping in. Claire didn't speak. She couldn't. "You reminded me who I was before the scars," he said softly. "I didn't want to disappear, but I had." She looked from him to the uniform, to the men behind him, to the low churning snow now marked by boot prints. She didn't know what to say. Dean reached into his coat and unfolded a sheet of paper. "This is a transcript," he said, "of the speech I gave at the Pentagon 3 days ago, when I received the Distinguished Service Cross." He handed it to her. At the top was an embossed seal. Halfway down the page, highlighted in faint yellow, a sentence read, "And to the woman in the cafe who saw me as a person when I felt invisible, thank you." That single act of humanity mattered more than medals ever could. Behind him, another officer stepped forward with a triangle-folded American flag held reverently in both hands. "In honor of compassion beyond duty," he said, offering it to Claire. Claire took it like it might break. She looked around, noticed the small crowd beginning to form at the edge of the street. Irene stood with her arms crossed tightly against the cold, and Hank stood beside her, leaning on his cane, expression unreadable. Hank leaned toward Irene and said, just loud enough for Claire to hear, "That boy walked like a soldier, but he left here like a man reborn." Dean stepped closer. "If you're willing," he said, voice careful, "we'd like to take you somewhere, just for a few hours." Claire looked down at the coffee pot in her hand, then at the men flanking the sidewalk, at the helicopter parked in the field just beyond the diner, its rotors now slowed, blades glinting in the fog. She nodded once, slowly, still holding the pot. She didn't change out of her apron. The cafe door closed gently behind them. The snow beneath her boots crunched louder than she expected. The propeller blades started again, the sound pulsing, whump, whump, whump. Red lights from the landing gear caught the front window just right, casting a shimmer over the painted letters of Claire's table. The helicopter door opened. Claire put her hand on the armrest. "You're sure this isn't a mistake?" Dean smiled. "You didn't make one. I'm just fixing mine." Claire had never flown before, certainly not in a seat wrapped in leather above the clouds, with her name stitched on a napkin. The aircraft hummed with a sound more velvet than thunder, steady and smooth. It wasn't like the commercial jets Claire had seen on television, where cramped aisles and noisy passengers filled every corner. This was quieter, more deliberate. The polished wood, the warm cabin light, the soft blanket draped over her lap, none of it felt real. Even the air smelled different, cleaner somehow. Dean sat across from her, no longer in full uniform, but in a dark sweater, hands folded loosely in his lap. He wasn't talking much, and she didn't mind. The silence felt mutual, understood. Between them was a tray of small breakfast items and a folded itinerary printed on embossed paper. She hadn't looked at it yet. "This isn't about medals or speeches," Dean had said earlier, just above the rotor hum of the helicopter. "It's about someone seeing me when I couldn't see myself." She hadn't answered. Some words didn't need replies. After landing, a military van took them across a quiet airfield. The base was crisp and orderly, but not unkind. Young men and women in uniform passed by, nodding, some curious, some reverent. The hallway they entered was lined with plaques, each carefully mounted beneath soft overhead lighting. One bronze panel read, "Civilian Honor Wall." Dean stopped in front of a newly polished plate. Claire stepped forward, breath-catching. Her name was etched clearly beneath a simple phrase, "For restoring human dignity." No flowery words, no ceremony. Just truth. She stared for a long time. A moment later, a young soldier walked past, no more than 20. His uniform crisp, his jaw tense. A thin scar ran down the side of his cheek, the kind you noticed and tried not to. He didn't speak, but as he passed, he gave her a slight nod. His eyes met hers only briefly, and in them she saw something unspoken. Something raw, gratitude without fanfare. Dean led her away gently, down a quieter corridor until they reached a small room with a wide window looking out toward the tarmac. A wooden box sat on the table. Simple, unvarnished. "I kept this longer than I should have," he said, placing it in her hands. She opened the lid slowly. Inside, cushioned in navy blue velvet, was the same dog tag he had once left on her booth table, now threaded with a new chain, gleaming silver. "Some names we carry," Dean said quietly. "Others we give back to those who helped us remember." Claire's fingers trembled as she touched the metal. Her throat closed before any words could come. She just held the box to her chest, eyes damp, breath catching in soft stutters. They sat for a while without speaking. Then Dean reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim envelope. Inside were 2 plane tickets. "Hawaii," he said. "Round trip, first class." He slid one ticket toward her. "One for me, one for someone I trust." She didn't answer, just exhaled slowly, unsure if the warmth in her chest was gratitude or disbelief. By late afternoon, Claire stood once again inside her café. The sun filtered through the windows in long golden beams, dust dancing in their path. The open sign in the window had been turned backward since dawn. She reached up and flipped it gently forward, the suction cup on the glass squeaking faintly. The shop smelled like cinnamon again. Booth 4 was empty, but the coffee pot on the counter was freshly filled, steam curling in the light, waiting. In the quiet, she moved to the wall beside the photo of her mother. She gently rehung the dog tag on a small nail above the frame. Below it, she pinned a handwritten note, the ink still wet. Kindness served here daily. Even after the coffee cooled and the snow melted from the steps of Claire's table, something invisible had shifted, not in the town, but in the quiet space people leave behind when they are truly seen. What began as a simple act of warmth grew into a story of dignity restored, proof that kindness, when given without condition, travels farther than we ever imagine. In a world often too quick to look away, someone chose to look closer, and in doing so helped a soldier find his way home. Like a porch light left on through the night, compassion doesn't call attention to itself, but it helps people find where they belong. If this story warmed you, perhaps let that light stay on for someone else too.